Don's Wife, Chapter 2. The sound of lashes, echoing in the dead of night, was highly menacing. Almost all the inmates clung to the bars of their cells and looked in the direction of the source with fear writ large in their eyes. But there was astonishment on their faces too, perhaps because, strangely, there was no scream or sound of any kind from the recipient of the lashes. The sound came from the annexee at the end of the long corridor in front of the cells. His teeth were clenched and his eyes looked piercingly into the distant oblivion, an animalistic gleam widening in them each time the leather whip struck his bare back, presenting a ghoulish expression on his face rather than that of a helpless victim. In contrast, the older man who was administering the lashes wore a distinct expression of remorse and pain, while small bulbs of tears flashed in his eyes as he struck each lash. The annexee where the activity was taking place was a barrack of 3 cells joined together with a corridor in front of them at the end of the south wing of the jail. Each cell was at least double the size of a normal one. The partition walls between them were made of sliding iron bars instead of brick and mortar. But the contents of the 3 adjoining cells presented a very discordant picture, as they looked like the living quarters of a normal householder rather than that of a convict in a jail. One cell resembled a tastefully arranged sitting room with a nice and comfortable sofa set, a dining table, a TV set, a bookshelf cum writing desk, and other necessary paraphernalia. In the other cell, a nice bed, a closet, and a dressing table were arranged beside a covered partition housing a toilet cum shower room. The third cell had humble arrangement of a single narrower bed and an ordinary closet and a table in addition to the shower cum toilet enclosure. Even as the skin on his back ripped open and blood rippled out with each lash, the handsome man in his early 40s did not wince even once, and defiantly remained grounded to his position, with his legs spread apart and his body almost horizontally bent over his arms that tightly gripped the 2 bars. He wore only a cotton pajama, which was wet with sweat around his waist and stained with streaks of blood at places. The thick moustache of the grey-haired older man in his late 50s was hardly able to hide the deep grimace that he experienced with each strike. As he seemed to falter and perhaps deliberately miss out a strike or two, there was immediately an indicting retort in a hoarse though pained voice from the recipient of the lashes. "Pow! You are slowing down. Don't stop. There are still 6 minutes left." The striker wiped his tears which had spilled out with the sleeve of his dark shirt and recommenced the lashing while saying in a painful but abiding tone, "Yes, Harsh beta, I'm doing. And his eyes flooded with a fresh bout of tears as he administered another sharp lash on the young man's back. Harsh's masochistic indulgence had a maniacal quality to it, as the dilated pupils of his eyes spasmodically drowned in a haunted expression on recalling a dreadful horror of the past. Large glass windows suddenly exploding into flames, shards of glass and pieces of iron and mortar as well as other debris flying out amid the blackness of smoke and redness of leaping flames, the accompanying cacophony of sounds of children screaming. Bhau slackened once again, and once again he was admonished by Harsh, only more hoarsely this time. You are again gone slow, Bhau. Strongly, please. There is still 3 minutes left. Yes, Harsh, sure. Bhau said in a repressed sob, while struggling with the bulbs of tears burning his eyes, and struck another sharp lash. At that precise moment, in another corridor, a young officer in his mid-20s, in a junior jailer's uniform, was moving towards the sound of lashing with ferocity. His face contorted with anger and fury, and his eyes spread wide as that of a wild animal. The echoing sound of each lash was sending him into a rage that was exploding through his eyes. He had now started running towards the source. A couple of aides were struggling to keep pace with him while pleading with him to stop, even trying to physically restrain him. Saab, please stop, Saab, screamed one of them. Saab, don't go, Saab. Please, listen to what I say, Saab, pleaded the second one. The other inmates, clinging to the bars of their cells with anxiety-ridden faces, watched the spectacle with horror as the young officer continued to gallop like a wild animal, followed by the aides. One of them almost pounced upon the officer with his hand grasping his shoulder, but the officer not only shrugged off the hand, but in raging retort, pushed him off, sending him rolling down in the corridor. Within seconds, the young officer had stormed into the corridor of the annexee. Flinging open the iron door, he almost leapt in with explosive fury and came to an abrupt halt, barely balancing and saving himself from tripping over. He was face to face with Harsh, spread-eagled in front of him, behind the bars of the barrier, and Bhau standing right behind him, giving him lashes. In a flash, he drew his gun and, pointing at Bhau, shot an order. Stop! However, Bhau merely gave him an evasive look and administered another sharp lash. The officer shouted again, Stop, or I'll shoot you. Bhau again gave him an evasive and somewhat disdainful look, and his whip flew again. The young officer immediately pulled the trigger, but suddenly, from nowhere, a hand came and turned his wrist upwards, just as the bullet ricocheted at the ceiling of the corridor with an attendant metallic sound as it apparently hit the iron beam. It was a middle-aged uniformed jailer who kept his grip on the young officer's wrist while shouting his order to the aides. Hold him! Immediately the two aides immobilized the young officer in a firm grip from behind, while at the same time relieving him of his gun. The senior jailer ordered again in an angry voice, while pointing at the grilled iron door from where the young officer had barged in. Out! Take him out! The young officer, completely immobilized by the hefty aides, was almost flung out of the door, with the rest of them also leaping after him. The senior jailer turned around and apologetically addressed a very mean-looking Harsh, already staring at him with pointed eyes. Sorry, Harsh bhai. He's a new chap. It won't happen again. Later on the same night, in his office, the senior jailer was trying to pacify the highly agitated young officer, who was by now extremely worked up about the flouting of jail rules and disregard of law and order. You are getting a little too twisted up, Panditji. Fresh from the university, eh? I can understand your predicament, he remarked playfully before coming around the desk and addressing him from very close. Now tell me something, Babua. Do you wear the janev? The young officer was confused and nonplussed. The older officer continued in a tongue-in-cheek manner. Tell me. The young officer shrugged his shoulders. Arey bhai, your name is Arun Tripathi. Hence, you have to be a high-caste Brahmin, right? So don't you wear the janev? Yes, I do. I too wear the janev. Arun looked at him quizzically. Now tell me, Arun Tripathi Sahib, how many threads are there in your janev? Tell me, how many strings does your janev have? What is this? How can I know this? Right, even I can't tell. I too wear a janev. My janev is also a janev. Your janev is also a janev. But it is not necessary that your janev must have the same number of threads as mine. Arun Tripathi looked confused and unresolved as he gawked at his senior, who continued. So many things that we talk about, many rules which are told to us, have to be understood only broadly, in bullet form. One doesn't have to do the hair splitting about it. He gestured the action by his hands. After a pause, he said, one invariably has to do a bit of this and a bit of that. Arun still seemed to be out of his depth. You didn't quite follow what I just said, right? Arun nodded blankly. The senior continued. Okay, do one thing. Just take a stroll up to the hospital in our jail. Harsh Jadhav's dressing must be going on there. Bhau will be there too. Go and have a look at them. Check up whether everything is all right. And while you do this, you will automatically get to know the secret behind your query. After a long silence, Arun Tripathi said, I see. Go. He is in your charge only. Ji, Arun said submissively and left. He entered the dressing room quietly and stopped behind the curtain divider which covered him nearly up to his chest. He looked at the proceedings in front of him through the space over the shoulders of Bhau and an old male orderly standing near the divider, with their backs towards him. He faced Harsh seated on the table and could see the dressing being done on his back and the chest by a surgeon, assisted by a female nurse. For a couple of seconds, Harsh became conscious of someone's presence behind the curtain divider and slowly lifted his eyes to take an oblique searching look at him. Arun also met his eyes for barely a second or two and then dropped them. In this split-second exchange of looks, both became aware of the alienation between them, as well as the intrigue-ridden curiousness about each other. In a while, Arun turned around and exited. A long look was exchanged between Harsh and Bhau, and after another second or two, Bhau also turned around and left through the same door. Arun stood pensively leaning by a column in the veranda opening into the lawn. Just as he lit a cigarette for himself, Bhau appeared from behind and stood by the other column a few feet away from where Arun was. He too lazily leaned by the column, staring vacantly at nothing in particular. There was a good bit of space between them, vacant yet unpenetrable, through which the dressing activity on Harsh was visible beyond the glass panes of the large window behind them. In a moment, Without looking at Arun, Bhau took out a bit of gutka. While chewing on it, he said broodingly, as though to himself, "It was a terrible night. We had taken the supari, no doubt, but it was a heavy responsibility. A slight mistake could cost dearly. Our boys had done the full investigation. They had repeatedly inspected the place and had checked the timings of the target. They had even done the dry runs secretly." He reminisced, and then his tone turned heavy and remorseful. "Still, we faulted." He took a pause and then continued in an anguished voice. "Nobody in his wildest dreams could have thought that a children's delegation will arrive to meet the Vice-Chancellor at that precise time." While he described the incident in sparingly spoken words, his eyes turned glassy and his face seemed to contort. Perhaps his mind began to rerun the dreadful happening. The Vice-Chancellor greeting many children in his chamber, shaking hands and putting his hand on their heads in blessing. And then the recollection turned sluggish and surrealistic, like a film running in slow motion. Suddenly, a series of explosions in the room. Glass and furniture and human limbs flying into the air, and then even more slowly, floatingly, the debris beginning to fall. Bhau seemed shaken, though he still chewed on his gutka. A vehicle passed by, and as it took a turn, its headlights illuminated his eyes, half filled with tears, giving an illusion of the explosion that he was recalling. After another long brooding pause, he spoke again in a heavy voice. 11 lives were lost, besides the Vice-Chancellor, in that dreadful incident. Innocent young lives. It's been 6 years today. Every year on this day, for full 11 minutes, 1 minute for each child, Bhai punishes me. His eyes had welled up even more. He turned his face to Arun and continued plaintively. Is it less than any punishment? I have raised him from his childhood. I only have to whip him now for full 11 minutes. He doesn't let me off from even one single lash to administer. And these hands, he looked at his hands and continued remorsefully. They don't get even a tiny stain of blood with what they do. Suddenly he broke down. He does the penance for himself and punishes me in the process. Arun slowly turned to look at Bhau, who was now weeping unreservedly. In a moment, he slowly moved up to Bhau and put his hand on his shoulder comfortingly.